There we go. It looks like we're on live Table Talk for Friday, May 1st. And I'm glad that you will be here. Nobody's on yet. But today we're just wanting to, first of all, bring a couple of announcements to you. Thankful again for what the Lord is doing in this season. Lots of reasons to rejoice in the Lord. Lots of good news reports that we've heard from you, ways that we're encouraged, ways that you're encouraged. And yet at the same time, many reasons to be continuing to pray for one another. Lots of trials and challenges, but I think of Paul's words, how he says that we're sorrowful yet always rejoicing. A couple things that I wanted to mention and Gary wanted to mention today. First off, I wanted to mention that next Friday, after our table talk at 4 o'clock, we will have the highly esteemed Patty Hill, and she will be leading us in a hymn sing. And so we're looking forward to that. Patty has said she'd love to come out and serve us. And so we'll just make sure that gets out in the announcements on Sunday. But for the three of you who are watching right now, you can also look forward to Patty next week at 4 o'clock. I know, Gary, you've been working on a couple things as well.
Yeah. So today, Andrew, we had intended, or are still going to do, a table talk dedicated to how we can engage people evangelistically during the COVID-19 crisis. Is there any ways in which we ought to be orienting our minds and keeping the current context in mind such that we minister more effectively? And toward that end, we're only going to cover a couple of things today, probably in 20 minutes, right? So we understand this is a big topic. I've had some of the congregants come to me as well and say, what do you suggest in this situation or that? And so we really want to serve you, and we know we can't do it in a simple table talk. We'll whet your appetite today for something bigger in a couple of weeks. I've secured Corey McKenna to come alongside the two of us as well for Wednesday, the 13th of May. And our plan is to do something a bit interactive, where we take questions either ahead of time or even live in a Zoom meeting. We'll prepare some training and teaching and thoughts around how we as Christians can minister the Word of God and Christ to people during this time. Have a better understanding even of ourselves, of our own faith, and how it ministers to us and then ministers to others. And so look for that. We'll get some more information out to you in a bit. But the 13th of May, circle that. Probably something like a 7 to 8:30 time slot. We'll record it, though, as well if you can't make that time, so you can look to it afterward. Two other resources, too, I want to mention, just because, like I say, some congregants are looking for ways in which they can better minister Christ. And a couple of books have come out recently written by two great men. John Piper has written a book called Coronavirus and Christ. I believe that's still a free download. If you go to desiringgod.org and look at the books, it used to be a red banner earlier in the week, right at the top of the page, or go to the books section of his website. I think it's still a free download. Various sorts of downloads as well. John Lennox as well, you might know him. He's known as an apologist, professionally a mathematician at Oxford University. He's one of my teachers the first year that I had there in apologetics. And he's written a book called Where is God in a Coronavirus World? Now, I got that book for free from RZIM. I might be able to pass it on, so if you're interested, send me an email, and I'll see if I can slip it over to you as well. And those are two good, recent, right off the presses books that are dealing with this for Christians.
And I wanted to mention just two other quick things. And one is that our exciting annual general meeting is still going to happen, except via Zoom. And it will happen on, I believe it's Saturday the 23rd of this month. And so we're going to focus on what has the Lord been doing in 2019, how can we celebrate, and give you an update with respect to how do we perceive ministry moving forward as we face a lot of uncertainties. So put that on your calendar. It'll probably be an early Saturday morning, and continental breakfast is provided by you. So we're thankful. But today what we wanted to do is we wanted to talk a little bit, Gary, you and I have been chatting just briefly today about how do we engage people in this time with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I know that both you and I, we've had opportunities with neighbors and family members. And so we wanted to think today about three things about what's our method, what's our heart, and what are the opportunities. And so as we think about engaging people with the gospel, especially in a time like we're in right now, what kind of advice would you give to people with regards to the method that they should be using when it comes to talking to neighbors, friends, family members about Christ?
Probably 20 things come to mind, and we only have 20 minutes. So again, tune in a week and a half from now when we have more extended time. But maybe firstly, still be a good listener. All right, you've got to be a good listener. Listening is so important. Last fall, I think when we worked through, or was it even 2 falls ago, when we were looking at mission and encouraging you toward mission, I know you wrote an e-bulletin on the importance of good questions. Well, you only have good questions if you've got good listening. And right now, our society is upside down in a way that it's not familiar with at all. We don't have the same sense of control that it's a lie. We really don't ever have control, but we're under this illusion of control because of our prosperity, because of our comfort, and so that's turned upside down. And so people are upset in different ways, and so you've got to understand, where are they coming from? We're trying to process this intellectually, we're trying to process it emotionally, and many people are trying to process it spiritually as well. And so trying to gauge where those questions are, where is the upset in this person's heart? Is it something that's intellectual? And so if it's on that level, please don't give false information. Know your limits. We all are trying to stay abreast of facts, and so don't be one of those that gives a bad testimony of Christ by conveying fake news, as it's called today. There's so much bad information out there, so try to get the best information you have that's out there, and if you don't have it, please don't give it, all right? That's not a good testimony to Christ if you're trying to deal with someone's legitimate questions. If it's emotional or spiritual, then hear the question and hear the question behind the question as well. We've often talked about that. If it is spiritual, then I think it's a great opportunity for us to go deeper into our own theologies. I've been thinking this week, Andrew, of the importance of having a good sense of providence, a good answer for providence. So if God really is in control, then why do we have this? Can I read the Heidelberg Confession?
Yeah, please do.
I like historical stuff, and there's some really great catechisms out there. Heidelberg says this: what do you understand by the providence of God? The answer is this: providence is the almighty and ever-present power of God, by which he upholds, as with his hand, heaven and earth, and all creatures, and so rules them, that leaf and blade, rain and drought, fruitful and lean years, food and drink, health and sickness, prosperity and poverty, all things, in fact, come to us not by chance, but by or from his fatherly hand. That's the historical Christian position. I don't think it's necessarily the historical or the recent history Christian position, because I think all of us have sort of drunk the societal Kool-Aid that we're in control of things. And so this is a great opportunity to reorient the thinking and to challenge a worldview that says you're in control, you're the master of your domain and your destiny. And really, we're the masters of neither. And what does the Christian faith speak to? Today I wrote my e-bulletin from 1 Peter 5:8, inspired by 1 Peter 5:8, where Peter says his going away instructions in that letter are to be sober-minded. This is to a church that's suffering persecution. They know it. They know trials and sufferings. And he says, be sober-minded, be vigilant, be watchful. And this is coming from the guy who, of course, fell asleep at the most opportune moment, right? He's in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus tells him to pray. It's the hour of all of human history, the culmination of history, and Peter's asleep. So he speaks from personal experience. And so this call to be sober-minded for us, it's so important for us. It's an opportunity for us to in a way, give that testimony of Christ, that reason for the hope that is within you when all around us seems hopeless.
And that just leads automatically to the question of how are we to, what's our heart disposition to be like? And our method of speaking truthfully and being mindful of our neighbors, being mindful of our witness for Christ, that falsehood does not advance the gospel, is so important. But at the same point, there's a heart disposition that we ought to have. I think of even how Peter frames that up in his letter, and when he talks about in your hearts honor Christ as Lord, as holy, always being prepared to make a defense for anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is in you. You notice that even before you get to the reason for the hope that is in you, Peter says to, in your heart, set apart Christ as Lord, to honor him. And we want to honor Christ. Honoring Christ obviously includes sharing the gospel, but there are ways, Gary, you and I have talked about, our hearts have to be aligned to honor Christ. And so what kind of heart dispositions can we have as we think about sharing the gospel with others that will, in a sense, commend the gospel, not just by our words, but by our very lives and our hearts as well?
Mm-hmm. This could be the answer to almost everything, but it really does start with God, I think. Starting with good theology and recognizing who and what God is. We were talking today in our staff meeting. Andrew's been reading a great little book and shared from it of the nature and the heart of God being, remind me of the quote exactly.
Gentle
and
gentle. Lowly.
Yeah, he's gentle and lowly, gentle and meek of heart. And boy, I can say my first forays into sharing Christ as a new Christian were not gentle and lowly of heart. It's something I had to learn, usually because I was so rejected, soundly rejected. In fact, I can remember one close relative, I'll just say, not immediate family, but close relative, said to me, Gary, I don't want what you have. Now, she was not really rejecting Christ there. She was, maybe. I don't know technically what was happening there, but I think really she was rejecting me. She looked at me and said, whatever you have can't be good enough for me to want. And it really caused me to look more deeply then into what is the heart of God, because when we share Christ out of a wrong motivation, if it's sharing Christ to win an argument, sharing Christ to show that you're better before God than they are, they feel that. And it doesn't actually convey the gospel at all. The gospel is about weak people accepting the strength of Christ. Not about strong people, not about good people, not about people even with good potential, and so God chooses you. No, he's chosen you because of his magnanimous mercy toward us, and that alone. And so when we minister out of some position of superiority or strength, it really undercuts our very message. So motivation and heart attitude toward those that we're trying to minister, and maybe on the COVID front, Andrew, to speak specifically to that, is to recognize the challenges all of us are under. This is unprecedented. And so you are having heart issues yourself. You're struggling with, am I going to pay next week's bills? Am I going to get hours from my boss next week? Are my kids going to get this? Am I a carrier? Am I actually going to bring sickness into my own household because of the risks I'm undertaking to care for it? All of those things are weighing upon your heart. And if you're not sober-minded and setting your hopes and affections in Christ, it will affect how you see others. Then recognize, of course, other people are in the same boat. And so be merciful toward them. Have the same attitude, this being gentle and lowly of heart. It says of the Lord, a bruised reed he will not break. And so that's how we ought to be as well toward the outsiders.
I think, and Gary, you bring us back to something that, even as you've said, there's the struggle that we all go through in our lives, which is that we are zealous for the truth. We are passionate as believers. We We want to share this message earnestly. And at times we can come across either as know-it-alls or as self-righteous people, or we can even come across like our lives have been put together and we're on the inside and you're on the outside. And yet, and yet the heart of Jesus, as Jesus looked upon the crowds, he saw them as sheep without a shepherd. He had compassion upon them. He fed them. He taught them. And as Augustine said, the only time that we get a window into the heart of Jesus, I believe it's Matthew 11, where Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy burdened, and I'll give you rest." Because what is his heart? "Take my yoke upon you, for I am gentle and lowly in heart." What is the very heart of God? If I think of how God knows all things, he knows my sin. He's seen everything of me. He's seen me not only at my best, but at my absolute worst. And he's moved towards me in Christ. He's forgiven my sins. He's loved me. He's pursued me. And he's done that knowing all the things, the beginning to the end of my story. He knows my entire life, all of my failures, all of my weaknesses. And yet his heart towards me has been gentle and lowly. And then it makes me think of all of the qualifications that Paul lays out for an elder, that an elder ought to be gentle, and the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but gentle to be instructing. And if there's anything that I continue to have to learn in my own life is gentleness, and knowing that I can have an assertive personality that can come across in a way that pushes people away. How much more do I need to have the gentleness of Jesus? And so the heart disposition, it's not just about finding the right opportunity or that moment, but also having the heart disposition that's moving towards people, that humility, and that pursues them. But then that leads into the question, well, what about opportunities, Gary? We can talk about methods and we can talk about the heart disposition, but we still have to think about the fact that there are potential opportunities that exist right now. So what kind of opportunities do you see that exist in this current moment for us to testify to Christ?
I think it's been pretty well documented, some of the negative impact on society that we see. Panic buying is probably the foremost in our minds, clearly rooted in fear and selfishness. But I think we also see a longing for community. So maybe you've experienced this as well, that you're out, perhaps you're walking with a child or a family member, or you're walking your dog, and you see a neighbor. You know they're a neighbor, but you've never maybe spoken to them, and they wave to you. They give a greeting to you. They stop even, and keeping their distance, they talk with you. And there seems to be an openness to relate. I think all of us in our sort of exile from humanity, maybe we didn't know what we had and we miss it. You know, we're more and more insular always as a society, and yet now that we have enforced insularity, it almost seems to be bringing out this longing for true community. And I think that's an opportunity to minister Christ and the Christian community and what it offers. Now, we have to recognize, I think, Andrew, that we are a little bit limited, though, as well. So I fully know that this isn't a time when you can take that neighbor that you just met on the sidewalk and then invite them for a barbecue. That's for another day. But do take note. Take mental notes. Maybe keep a little notebook of who you met and where they live and what was that question they asked or presented or that concern or fear. And then pray about it and have God minister to your heart such that you can, out of that fullness, minister to them.
And as we recognize the limitations of it, think of as this is a current moment where we're not going to be able to do as much as we'd like because we're not going to be having people into our homes as easily as we once were. And maybe that day will come sooner than later, but we don't know. to accept those limitations and to be building and preparing for the day where we have those bridges to make those invitations. But there are plenty of opportunities that exist right now. Some might even exist under your own roof. I see this season as a great blessing with all of my children, all four of my children at home, and spending extra time with them, picking up the phone and connecting with family. Some family members that are from my extended family that I've not been in touch with for years, and now I've had the opportunity to reconnect because of different scenarios and crises and hardships. And in light of that, uh, I'm reminded of every day to make the most of the opportunities that exist. It doesn't mean that I have to get the ball all the way down the field on the first play. That it's okay to go yard by yard and try to get the first down and then keep pressing towards the goal line. We want to play the long game and recognizing God's in control. I want to be faithful. I don't want to use those this season as an excuse as to avoid contact or to say, well, I'm just trying to move the ball a couple inches. That's not the reason, but to be mindful that God does work over the long term and even beyond our lives to accomplish his purposes. Gary, any last thoughts as we wrap up today in terms of how do you want to encourage someone today as they think about ministering the gospel in this time?
A couple ideas. One, just as you were talking there, I was thinking too that we still, maybe especially at this time, have service opportunities. We both believe that, just as Christ was, you mentioned the compassion of Christ. Interesting, the many translations talked about being moved with compassion, right? So that compassion of Christ moved him towards service. And we have great service opportunities. We know many of you have been connecting with your senior neighbors or those that are isolated by necessity. Do those, continue to do those things, that neighborliness of connection, of serving. How can I help? And thank you for doing that. And that, I think, creates, a legitimacy, a moral authority almost to minister the gospel when you have actually served, when you've given that cup of water that Christ talks about. Many will ask, like, when did I give you a cup of water? When did I feed you or clothe you? And he will say, when you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. And who are those least in our community right now? It may not look like they're least because they've got a fine home or fancy cars, but they are least in some respects because they're disadvantaged right now, and you have an opportunity to serve. And then secondly, just again to remind you, we're going to do this far more thoroughly and probably with a bit more preparation when a week and a half roughly from now, 2 Wednesdays from now on the 13th of May, we're going to have Corey come join us. Probably 7 to 8:30 is what I'm envisaging, but keep an eye out in your email for the details. And we'll look at some significant theological themes, for instance, like how are we to speak of God? Like judgment is one thing we didn't talk about today, but a lot of people are probably wondering, like, is this the judgment of God? Or why would God judge in this way if he is? Is he sovereign? Like, how can he be sovereign if there's a pandemic around? All of these questions are fantastic questions. They're natural questions, and we've got good answers to them. And so I look forward to that time, and we'll continue to look to equip you. Send in your emails, send in your questions if you've got them, and we'll give that consideration.
And so we've taken a little bit more time than our 20 minutes today, but for those of you who've joined us today, thank you. God bless your Friday. I'm always happy to wear fun socks on Friday, so we'll look forward to what I wear next Friday. And Patty Hill, again, will be joining us next week, Friday at 4 o'clock for a hymn sing. And we're looking forward to just having this video go viral and more people coming to Christ. In all seriousness, we're just glad to serve you. And we are thankful for each of you. God bless you, and we hope that you're able to join us Sunday morning at 10:30 when we worship our risen Christ, the sovereign King. God bless.
God bless. Have a great weekend.